Welcome to Old Path Ministries and our study through the book of Judges. We are in chapters 15 and 16 today, and we'll take those just by themselves since it really kind of closes this part of the book of Judges when it comes to the man Samson. The first two chapters that we did right before this was the beginning of Samson's, kind of ascendancy, and where we learn about him and his time of 20 years of being a judge there in Israel. We know that this was a time God raised him up when the problem was with the Philistines. We talked a little bit about them last time and how they weren't native to the land. From everything that we can gather, they were kind of outside of that, and history records that they're more than likely just people that came from more the area of the around what is Greece and Turkey and up along the Aegean. But again, history is not absolute on that. But the consensus is that these are people that were not originally from the area. But that is incidental at this point. What we do know is where their encampments and where their cities were. Those are pretty well understood. It mentions that as Gaza here, and so that helps us in our understanding of the modern state of Israel, that it is along the Mediterranean coast, and it is as you're going on the west coast and south, headed towards the land of Egypt. Then that's kind of where we're talking about here. And their major cities, Ekron, Ashkelon, those cities that were up along that portion of the country. So anyway, the one thing that's kind of interesting when it comes to the Philistines, it appears as though, from everything that we can glean here, for whatever reason, Samson seems to have affection towards the women of the Philistines for some inexplicable reason, but he seems to really have a real, almost a hatred for the men of the Philistines. But what we know by what we read the last time, there is clearly a problem in the nation, and the Philistines are the oppressors. But we've seen a real downward, if you will, kind of a slide in the nation. And so I had pointed out the last time, we already have seen that they have already begun to war among themselves. What we looked at in the last chapter last week, or the last week's study, we see that there's just such hatred even among some of the people in Israel, and it seems like such a far cry from what had happened at the Exodus. But now again, we're hundreds of years into the history after Joshua brought them into the land. We've had this up and down through the times of the judges where the people would rebel against God, and that God would send kind of the judgment of the surrounding nations. And this is the first real mention of it being specifically the Philistines. And this man that's raised up is this man Samson. Now, of all of the judges, it is pretty obvious when you look at his life that Samson was just incredibly conflicted and so inconsistent. It's such a sad thing to look at because of all of the potential that was there, and the giftings that God had given him were just amazing, and yet he didn't seem to care for much of any of it. And his time was half the time seeming rebellion and always at war. What his whole story really kind of helps us in our understanding is what happens when someone compromises, and having every conceivable benefit up front. His whole life was one of just kind of up and down. It wasn't that God didn't use him and that he even empowered him supernaturally, but this is certainly a guy, when you look at Samson's life, you don't see much merit as far as godly things are concerned. God used him mightily. There's no doubt about it. You can't make the case otherwise. But you just see him as this incredibly flawed person that God uses, and sometimes he just does things completely in his own strength. You can tell it's obviously a man who is not governed by God, and he does things that are outright provocations to God. But again, when we try to look at this in the big picture, because somebody may ask the question, well, then why did God use him? And I always have the same answer for that, because God had made a promise all the way back to Abraham, and we needed to get to the time when God would make good on that promise of raising up someone that would end up saving the nation, that being the person Jesus, and he is actually also the Savior of the world. So had the children of Israel had been eradicated at the time by the nations who really would have loved to have done that, then that would have stopped that promise from really coming into fruition. And so them having the land, and we know the history of Israel. So when we take a look at this guy, Samson, what we can see is that there are times that he seems to really relish in the idea of vengeance, and just kind of, since you've done this to me, I'm going to do this to you. And the idea of retaliation, it really works on both sides. It's indicative of the Philistines, it's indicative of Samson. And it creates so much strife and problems, where really what should have happened at the beginning is that God should have someone who was really clued into him, whom he could raise up and use to overthrow the rule of the Philistines. And so, unfortunately, what we have here is, rather than being that kind of a person, it's just a pretty heavy cycle of they did this, he does that, and God gives him ability and all the rest of that. And not because he's a godly man, but because he's the one that God's going to use. You almost kind of wonder if it's just the best of his options, which is a pretty sad statement if you stop to think about it. But we'll take a look at all of this. Let's turn to chapter 15. That's where we'll pick up today. And we're going to find that, I'll point them out as we get to them, a couple of them where it says that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily. And that doesn't mean that he did consistently, because there were plenty of times when it was clear that that was not the case. So I want to take a look at something maybe before we start. But let's have a word of prayer first, and then we'll get into the text. Father, we want to thank you as you gather us here in this place, that we can come to your word, and that, as we study through history and we learn the things of it so that we become familiar with what you did among your people, at the same time, we want to learn the lessons that can be learned from this and see how it is that we might be able to make application. So we pray that you would give us understanding, and that you would give us wisdom in our hearing of your word, but then the correct application of how we might walk accordingly. And so we give you all thanks and pray that you glorify yourself through your study, through this study of your word. And we ask it in Jesus' name. All right. Turn with me to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32. And here is something that it would be nice if Samson had awareness enough to take a look back at what the law would have to say about the very thing, that you could look at his life and understand it. So if we were to, let's just say, write out on a piece of paper the things that we would most know Samson by, we could say that he was sensual, that he was a person who had an eye for women, and women that God would not have had him be involved with. We can certainly look at him and say that this was not a man who was God governed by any stretch of the imagination, but God still used him at that time, again because of the nation itself and because of the rise of almost call them Palestinians, the Philistines. Actually, if you think about it, just for the record, we get the word Palestinian from Philistia, or the land of the Philistines. And so it's just a play on the words. So if I mix them up, there's a reason why. So anyway, with all of that said, looking at these things with Samson, this was a man that was given to vengeance. And the problem with vengeance that we know, and the problem with it, is that the retaliation that comes along with vengeance is always, it's never really measured equally. So whatever someone has done, I always jokingly say this, we could prove this with any of you who have kids, you know this to be the fact, that whenever somebody does something, whenever the retaliation comes around, it's more severe than the thing that's being retaliated for. And that's a never-ending cycle. And maybe it's just man's way of doing things. I'm probably going to make myself sound guilty in this, but if I'm going to go to the trouble of having to retaliate, I'm going to get my money's worth, right? So my guess is that most people are probably the same way. The problem with vengeance is that it's never meted out in any kind of a judicious way, and also the person who is feeling somehow wronged and wants to retaliate is never going to be able to come to a knowledge of what is right, what is wrong, what is enough, what is too much. Mankind doesn't seem to have that ability to reason that well. And so it's something that should be left to God and God alone. And we get that from the book of Deuteronomy at chapter 32, at verse 34, it says, Is this not laid up in store with me, sealed up among my treasures? Vengeance is mine, and recompense, for their foot shall slip in due time, for the day of their calamity is at hand, and the things to come hasten upon them. This is God speaking here. So the idea of who is it that could avenge or give vengeance for an act? And it would be God alone. And so if Samson was really this man, this judge of Israel that he should be at this time, God may very well have done very much the same kinds of things through him, but it would have been at the direction of God. And so what we find really absent the more that we get into this era of history, it is more and more people acting on their own and less going to the Lord for his counsel before action. So it is kind of this never-ending mess of things. So chapter 15 begins this way. Now, after a while, in the time of the wheat harvest, it happened that Samson visited his wife with a young goat and said, Let me go into my wife into her room, but her father would not permit him to go in. So this goes back to the woman that he had wanted to marry. Of course, she has given the Philistines the answer to his riddle of, what's this riddle? And it was about the honey that was taken out from the carcass of the lion. And they would have never been able to get the answer to it. So again, this is from the last couple of chapters. And this was because he was going to be marrying this woman. And so at the marriage, at the feast that goes on for that week or so, he asks this question and says, here's the wager for you guys. If you can't figure it out, then you get me these fine linens and changes of clothes, 30 of them. And so long and the short of it is they go and they threaten Samson's wife and say to her, get us the answer or we're going to burn down your father and we're going to burn down your house. So she feels that pressure, keeps pestering him. Finally, he gives her the answer, and it was honey from the carcass of the lion. They give that answer. And so they demand that he pay up. So he goes to 30 of their fellows, and they're down in the area along the Mediterranean there, and he kills 30 of those guys, takes their garments and all that stuff, and gives it to those 30 guys. So kind of interesting how this whole thing goes on, and they're of course incensed over the whole thing. He leaves, and because his wife had betrayed him, doesn't consummate the marriage, anything else. They're just married in the ceremonial sense, and he leaves and just leaves her. Well, he's coming back now. Things have cooled down. We don't know how long this time is, but it says after a while is all that we get. At the time of the wheat harvest, he comes back, he says, let me go to see my wife, and her father won't let it happen. In verse 2, we read that her father said, I really thought that you thoroughly hated her, therefore I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister better than she? So please take her instead. Well, he's going to win Father of the Year for this one, clearly, but this says a little bit about the culture of the time, and again for these people as well. But interestingly enough, it doesn't seem as though there's that much time that's gone by, and so this is what's told to Samson. Needless to say, he's incensed. So Samson said to them, this time I shall be blameless regarding the Philistines if I harm them. It wasn't the father's right, as he sees it, to do this. The father doesn't come and ask him, doesn't make sure. He just assumes everything. And so once again, what does Samson revert to? Not because God told him to. He gets to the place of vengeance. I'm going to get revenge for this. So what does he do? Verse 4, he went and he caught 300 foxes. Now, reading up on who says this and the word that's used here, because foxes are pretty much solitary animals. Most would believe that this is more jackals, and so jackals more are in packs. It would be a little easier to catch that many of them. He probably had help, most would speculate, but it would be easier to round up 300 jackals than foxes, and either one of them could translate from this Hebrew word. Either one works. This is the jackal is much more likely because they are. They're common to that area. So with all of that said, doesn't matter. What we know is that they're little dog-looking kind of things. But here's what he does. So he went and caught these 300 foxes, took torches, and turn the fox's tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of the tails. So basically, he just ties some incendiary thing, these torches, between the fox's tails. And then when he had set the torches on fire, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and burned up both the shocks and of the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and the olive grove. So he just trashes everything. Now, when the Philistines said, "Who has done this?" and they answered, "It was Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to a companion." So the Philistines came up and they burned her and her father with fire. The exact thing that they threatened to do if she didn't tell them the riddle. Now they're still dying in the exact same way, because Samson says, that's how it's going to be. I'm going to get my retaliation, and look at all of the damage that happens. Destroys the fields. Because of that, the other Philistines are angry with her and with her father, and they kill them all, burn them, and we're right back to where this whole thing started. So verse 7, Samson said to them, "Since you would do a thing like this, I will surely take revenge on you, and after that I will cease." Well, hardly. That's not going to be the case, as we know. And once again, this is something where vengeance is something that belongs to the Lord, because he is just in his judgment. Samson is not. So it says he attacked them hip to thigh, just a kind of a metaphoric way of saying, incompleteness. It's a way of almost saying detachment. He just broke these people up. So attacked them hip to thigh with a great slaughter, and then he went down and dwelt in the cleft of the rock at Etam. And so again, there's a lot of, in the original language, it's kind of hard to really determine what this means, but it's a dwelling place where many would speculate that it's has a good overwatch, a good overlook kind of the area. However it may be, they know that he kind of went there. It was more of a solitary thing, but everybody knew where he was. And how do we know that? Well, because of how the rest of this goes. So the Philistines went up, they encamped in Judah, and they deployed themselves against Lehi. And the men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" And so they answered, "We have come up to arrest Samson, to do to him as he has done to us." So once again, the repetition. He retaliates, they retaliate, and it just keeps going and going and going. Now, after a while, you'd figure out that they would probably want to step away from this, because for whatever reason, every time that they come to blows with him, it really ends up poorly for them. Well, they're going to learn. Verse 11, so 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock at Etam and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines rule over us? What is this that you have done to us?" And so he said to them, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." So at this place, really think about this. This means that the children of Israel there in Judah had come to the point where they were okay, where they seemed somewhat settled in the fact that they were being ruled over by godless people. Rather than looking to the Lord and say, how do we fix this problem? Is Samson the one that you have chosen? We know that God has chosen Samson for this point, but nobody is really looking to the godly aspect of this. God uses him, like I said before, nonetheless, but to say that he is flawed is being incredibly charitable, as we see just in how he does the things. So, but they said to him, "We have come down to arrest you, and that we may deliver you into the hands of the Philistines." So Samson said to them, "Swear to me that you will not kill me yourselves." And so they spoke to him, saying, "No, but we will tie you securely, and we will deliver you into their hand, but we will surely not kill you." And so they bound him with 2 new ropes, brought him up from the rock. And so when he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting against him, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily. Very important. So this is that interesting thing, that there are those times when the Spirit comes upon him, and other times where he acts in his own strength, and yet he seems to have superhuman ability no matter what. The times that God uses him for what he wants him to do, those are the times that the Lord comes upon him. And so not only is it supernatural strength, but it is all the other things. And this is where God has him being used for God's purposes and not for his own retaliation and selfish ambition. Those are two different things here. So the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, and the ropes that were in his arms or on his arms became like flax that is burned with fire, and his bonds broke loose from his hands, basically turned him to ash. And so he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand and took it and killed 1,000 men with it. Now, of course, think about that. This is a stronger than normal jawbone, you would think, because after 1,000 guys, it's pretty hard to kill them just with a bone. However it was, it worked, and he used this. And so Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men. Now, again, this is poor in that he draws attention to himself. Remember, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. It was because the Lord loosed his bonds. He's able to fight against the Philistines. Big picture. God wanted to deal with the Philistines because they were an existential threat to his people. Samson is the man that he uses, though Samson is a mess. No matter how you look at it, no matter how God used him, and even in those moments where he may have seemed right in what he did, this guy was a pretty much a disaster. He was kind of a train wreck. Well, and now one of these days, I assume that I am going to see this man, and I'm going to have to explain to him why I called him that. Well, verse 17, and so it was when he had finished speaking that he threw the jawbone from his hand, and he called the place Ramath Lehi. And so that just means that it's the hill of the jawbone. So really funny. Ramath would be that hill of, and then so Lehi is the jawbone. So verse 18, and then he became very thirsty, cried out to the Lord, you have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised? Isn't this just like the people of this time? God does some amazing, incredible thing. They find out that they have some individual need, and they make it so dramatic. Instead of just saying, Lord, this work that's gone on here, it's overwhelming. May I please have something? Can you please provide something for me? There's no humility in this. Instead, it's like, I did this great work for you. Now you're going to bring me out here and kill me. God is so incredibly patient. It blows my mind. And how do I know that? Look at me. Well, verse 19. So God split the hollow place that was in Lehi, and water came out, and he drank, and his spirit returned, and he was revived, and therefore he called its name En-Hakkore, which is in Lehi to this day. And so that means that it's the En well of the one who cried. And so that's, again, they name it after these significant events that took place in those places. And it says it's still in this area of Lehi as it is to this day. And so it says now he judged Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines. Now, that would kind of sound like the ending of this particular episode of this particular guy. We know the length of his reign, the things that he did, but what this does, interestingly enough, it'll be kind of repeated, but this is almost like a little parenthetical. Though it's at the end of his life, the whole things that led up to this, but this is one more little part of his history, and it's the one that most of us are familiar with. No matter if you only know a little bit about the Old Testament, chances are you know the story of Samson and Delilah. Now, what we're going to find, this is now the second person that he's involved with from this part of the world, and he shouldn't be, and he ends up giving up information that leads to his detriment. In fact, with Delilah, obviously it leads to his death. But that is not the end of it, because there's an episode that happens first. Again, this is a morally flawed man. There's no doubt about it. Okay, so verse 1. Now, Samson went to Gaza, saw a harlot there. And harlot, yes, a prostitute in Gaza, a Philistine. Why he goes there is anybody's guess. Let's talk about, you almost go there just for reasons of provocation. You just know it's not going to end well when you go there. But he seems to feel somewhat invincible, and for Up until the whole thing with Delilah, he's been pretty much exactly that. Well, so the people of Gaza were told, Samson has come here. So they surrounded the place and they lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city, and they were quiet all night. And they said, in the morning, when it is daylight, we will kill him. So it would appear from this, it's not as though they knew the house, they would have just moved on it. They know that he's in that area, they know where he's gone, but there could have been any number of places that he went, so they figure they'd wait in ambush for him, and come morning, that's when we'll get him, right? Well, in verse 3 we read this, that and Samson lay low until midnight, and then so he also knew that they knew, and so what did he do? He goes out, he took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and of the two gate posts, he pulled them up, bar and all, put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Now, when you think about this, here's the picture that we can get. And again, it's a symbolic thing that he does here. Since we don't know exactly where the hills are and everything else, it doesn't appear as though he goes all the way to Hebron. It's 10 plus miles or somewhere thereabouts, depending on how far he's thinking. It's way out in the distance, but it is pointing to Israel's direction. And yet he's in the land of the Philistines. Okay, so what he does, I think most of the time we've probably seen the movies and the replicas of it, but the cities would have these massive gates. If you needed to bring in lots of things, you'd have that. Or within the massive doors, the massive gates, you could have smaller doors as well that would open up for just people coming in and out. It's those that he takes. And so from all appearances here, because other than that, he would be physically removing the massive gates that are in the thousands of pounds and putting them on his shoulder. It doesn't seem likely. But for him to do what he does, even this is superhuman in its exploits, its strength. It's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds. He just breaks it all apart and he puts it on his shoulder. It means he just carries it out of the city. So he comes to a hill and he puts them there so that they can be seen. Now, we might look at it and say, well, why would he do that? Why would he put it on the hill? Why facing Hebron? Again, remember that he's made it into their city. Cities are built with gates for the reasons of security, and they're watching the gates. Somehow he gets to this one that they've abandoned it, nobody's there, whatever. However, or may very well be that he took out the guards. We don't know, it doesn't tell us. Bottom line, when they are expecting to see him in the morning, they come to find out that their gates, their security has been breached. When they find the doors, they're perched more, they're set up in the hill area, and they're facing the area of Israel. Like, if these doors were to open, it would lead to where I would be coming from. Again, he does this for the symbolic reasons of it. You guys lay in wait, you expect me to come up in the morning and you're going to take me out. I'm going to show you that by the very things that you think that make you secure, I'll plunder those and put them, and I'll point them in the direction of where I left. It's comical as far as I'm concerned. I think it's pretty funny, actually. So verse 4, afterward, it happened that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. Now here again is where it goes from bad to worse for him. Now the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, now entice him. So what he does here, he does very openly and deliberately in front of everyone. So once again, he falls for a woman he has no business having anything to do with. She seems to be somewhat interested, but she seems very easily turned against him. So clearly she doesn't love the man, not as you would think, but I don't think there's a whole lot of what we would consider love in this anyway. This is a pagan woman, and this is a very, very heavily flawed Jewish man. Now, so it happened as he loved this woman, the lords of the Philistines, verse 5, came to her and said, entice him and find out where his great strength lies, and by what means that we might overpower him, that we might bind him to afflict him, and every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. She will be made fabulously wealthy in this if she just finds out what is his secret. Now, the verse 6, so Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies, and with what you may be bound to afflict you. How is it that anyone can stop you? Now, this is the first time that she asks the question. Of course, as far as Samson is concerned, he may very well just kind of think that this is funny, maybe not even try to put to her ulterior motives, but you would have to think he's got to be at least somewhat suspicious. Well, anyway, he answers and he says in verse 7, "So he said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, ones that are not yet dried, then I will become weak and be like any other man. And so the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, and she bound him with them." So Samson apparently seems to be playing along, unless it says that, or unless somehow she did this when he's not paying attention or asleep. We know that that happens later with another attempt, but this one seems like he's going along with it and that he's complicit. Now here's what's so weird about it. Verse 9, so men were lying in wait, staying with her in the room, and she said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he broke the bowstrings as a strand of yarn breaks if it touches fire, and so the secret of his strength was not known. Okay, great. So the ruse is put in place. He tells her something that is not in any ways true. She tries to go through it, and then she gives him what seems like a warning. Partially it would be a sign to the people, but it would get a reaction out of him. So the Philistines would know, be on the lookout, and then they would see whether or not it was true, and of course he breaks right through it. Now, she makes quite the fuss, and he breaks through the whole thing. By this time, you would think that he would be able to see through what's going on here. So you would think. But again, he doesn't think through things. We've already noticed that. So Delilah said to Samson, "Look, you have mocked me and you have told me lies. Now please tell me what you may be bound with." And so he said to her, "If they bind me securely with new ropes that have never been used, then I will become weak and be like any other man." Therefore Delilah took new ropes, bound him with them, and said to him, just like she said before, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And men were lying in wait, staying in the room, but he broke them off of his arms like thread. So again, the Philistines don't seemingly show themselves. Doesn't say that there's any altercation. As I see this and the way it's laid out, it would appear as though they're waiting. They're kind of ready to pounce. But once they see that he breaks through, they don't seem to reveal themselves, because there's nothing that tells us that anything happens here. But by this time, again, how is he not suspicious? What are her motives? Why does she keep trying to do this? Is she just trying to find out whether I'm being honest with her? What's the deal? Why is this? Now, had there been something that had broken out, like I had said, there's nothing that tells us that there was any kind of altercation. You would figure that at that point, any reason that he might be able to come up with other than she's trying to set me up, that would have been ruined the moment that they would have revealed themselves. And that's why I'm sure that there was no revealing of themselves. They were ready to, but as soon as he breaks out, they kind of keep to themselves. But he doesn't seem to get wise to this. And again, it's going to cost him everything. So Delilah said to Samson, "Until now you have mocked me and you have told me lies. Now tell me what you can be bound with." And so he said to her, "If you weave the 7 locks of my head into a web of the loom," so she wove, so because of that, weave it into a loom, so she wove it tightly with the batten of the loom, and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he awoke from his sleep, and he pulled out the batten of the web from the loom. And so, once again, this is supposed to be it. Just take a portion of my hair, weave it, and that he gives, again, the whole scenario. Again, it fails. And so she says to him, "How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times, and you have not told me where your great strength lies." And so it came to pass when she pestered him, I love the word, she pestered him daily with words and vexed him so that his soul was vexed to death. So she just bugs him to death. I'm tired of this conversation. You can almost picture it. To say, I love the word. We don't use it in English very often. To be vexed. It's just like, I'm at my wit's end. I don't even know what to say anymore. I'm just done. Just make it go away. I'll tell you whatever you want to know. Just leave me alone. It's kind of that type of thing that's taking place here. So I don't know if you guys find this comical. I certainly do. So he was vexed, and he's vexed to death. Verse 17. Then that he told her all that was in his heart, and he said, "Look, no razor has ever come upon my head, for I have had a Nazirite vow to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, then my strength will leave me, and I will become weak and be like any other man." So he tells her the source of his strength, and this is going to be his undoing. So unfortunately, for whatever reason, again, think about this. Here's a man that was told by an angel to his parents that your son is the one that's been chosen. He's to be a Nazirite. Now, if they didn't know what a Nazirite was, they could have looked it up, but they did know. He knows what it is. He knows that it's a vow that's been made to God, but does he live his life that way? Not hardly. The fact that he is there present with a Philistine woman is a huge problem. He's broken the vow as far as the letter is concerned by being close to a dead body, and that was of the lion. He had touched that defiled thing, and so clearly this guy's so far outside of that vow. He should have broken the vow a long time ago. There should have been a ritual cleansing that takes place. You can go back and look at what a Nazirite vow is from the law. He's so far outside of that, it's not even funny anymore. And yet there are still parts of it that God still honors even in this. So he tells her everything that she needs to know. So when Delilah saw that he had told her all that was in his heart, that she sent and she called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, "Come up once more, for he has told me all that is in his heart." And so the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought her the money and put it in her hand. And so she lulled him to sleep on her knees, and she called for the men who had shaved off the 7 locks of his head, and then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. So they cut off all of the hair. They got rid of his hair. And so she said to the Philistines, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And so he awoke from his sleep, and he said, "I will go out as before at other times, and I will shake myself free." But he did not know how the Lord had departed from him. So he has no sense of where he is. Now, other times that he had been bound, he had broken free. Of course, nothing ever came of it. In this case, something was going to come of it. But he didn't know that the Lord had departed from him. Very, very important thing. So the Philistines took him, put out his eyes. They gouged out his eyes. They brought him down to Gaza. They bound him with bronze fetters, and he became a grinder in their prison. He just put him to hard labor. This was their way of saying the guy who's created so much trouble, now look at what they've done to him. They've basically enslaved him. However, the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been cut. So it's coming back. And so it's not that he's made the vow, it's that God is going to still use him even at this time. And the Philistines are the ones that really ultimately God is judging here, even though he's using this incredibly imperfect man. So the lords of the Philistines, they gathered together to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. And they said, "Our God has delivered into our hands Samson, our enemy." And when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they had said, "Our God has delivered into our hands our enemy, the destroyer of our land, and the one who multiplied our dead." Now, they have obviously taken it a step too far. As much as we can talk about how flawed Samson is, we have to remember this. This is a man that God had raised up. And now, in an open provocation, they mock Samson, the man of God, and they worship their own little, carved image, Dagon, their deity. And so it's going to become a thing where God will one more time use this man, Samson, in his final moments, and it will be a judgment against the Philistines. So, verse 25, so it happened when their hearts were merry, that they said, "Call for Samson, that he may perform for us." We just want to make sport of him is really more what it looks like. So they called for Samson from the prison, and he performed for them, and they stationed him between the pillars. And so Samson said to the lad who held him by the hand, "Let me feel the pillars which support the temple so that I can lean against them." So the plotting is, he knows what he wants to do. He wants to bring the house down, if you will. And so he wants this to be, if he's going to go out, he's going to take them all out with him. He can't see what he's doing. So, of course, he's so incredibly diminished. He doesn't really feel, you can see he doesn't care whether he lives or not. He just wants, once again, to take vengeance on these people. And you'll notice that that's it. It's not, "God, I want to avenge you. I want to make good for your name." Here they openly mock you, worshiping their gods because they've been given victory over me. In fact, he never even really seems to look at himself to realize that he's the cause of all of this. He could have been the incredible victor. Instead, he is the victim, and he's going to need God to empower him one last time just so that he can defeat himself and everyone else in the process. So, in verse 27, "Now the temple was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, about 3,000 men and women on the roof watched while Samson performed." So there's just those on the roof. There are thousands of people here. Huge numbers. So Samson called to the Lord God, saying, "Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." It's like, you still don't get it. He's not incensed at the fact that they, in essence, mock God because of their worship of their God, thinking somehow that they have won this victory and that their God had given him into their hands. It was Samson's own carnality that caused this, not God's weakness. You see the problem here? So, verse 29, "So Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars which supported the temple, and he braced himself against them, one on his right and the other on his left. And then Samson said, 'Let me die with the Philistines.' And so he pushed with all of his might, and the temple fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead that he killed at his death were more than he had killed in his life." And we already have records of hundreds plus a thousand that he had already killed. This eclipses all of it. Well, it says, "And his brothers and all of his father's household came down, took him, brought him up, and they buried him between Zorah and Ashtaol, and the tomb of his father Manoah. And he had judged Israel for those 20 years, just like we see at the close of chapter 16. Now, we have chapter 17 through the end of the book, but that is really kind of, this will show that even a further kind of downward, if you will, trajectory of things. But we see that with every passing generation, it just gets worse to worse. Again, this is such a, oh my gosh, it's such a story of what could have been. And had he been obedient to the Lord and not just so given to his senses, he could have actually accomplished so much. And yet he didn't. So good takeaways for us in this is when God puts something in front of you, it's best to embrace it and not look for some other things to just satisfy your own flesh. And the recognition that it is not for us to look to retaliate. It's not for us to look to avenge ourselves. If he had things in its right perspective, he would have seen a few different things. Before I was born, God chose me for this task, and he will empower me to do this. If that's the case, I want to keep the vow that I make to him, and I don't want to be taken in by my own desires. God's going to use me to deliver his people from the oppressors. That's what he should have been. Now, we can see that God made an end of the oppressors for this time, but not much else in between was really what it should have been. And so Samson is a case study in what could have been. But again, this was a time during the nation when not many were seeking him anyway. And it's why a person even so greatly empowered by God could have such an up and down kind of an existence. A lot that could be learned here. The idea of really laying hold of everything that God has laid hold of you to do. I contrast him with a guy like Paul, who, even though Paul would say, "I'm not a perfect man," we would look at Paul and say, Yeah, but he was incredibly obedient, and he saw the place and time where God had taken him, and he laid hold of it. And he was used of God in the most dynamic ways of anyone that we know that did anything like he did in the history of the church. Paul is a pretty unique guy. Samson is unique, but for a lot of the wrong reasons. But think about it. We know so much about this guy just because of the stories, and it's really a story of failure if you think about it. Samson's whole life, from beginning to end, the end result of the Philistines, he pretty much accomplished what God wanted him to do. But he could have accomplished so much more and really been that person that the people of the nation could have looked to, but we get nothing of that part of his history. It's not given to us, even what he did in those 20 years. So with all of that said, interesting. We'll be able to finish this out probably in the next 2 weeks to get through the end of the book of Judges. Been very interesting, but it's going to lead us to, we're getting very close to the time of the close out of the Judge, which brings us to the time of the prophets. Now we get to Ruth next, and then we're going to start to get to those other kind of historical books when it comes to the kings and all the rest. So we'll keep making our way through this, and we'll pick there up next week. I hope that you've enjoyed this as you look at it. It's not really, enjoy, I guess, is a weird word for it. It is, in some cases, kind of comical and yet tragic at the same time. So we'll continue our study through this book, and we'll pick up there next week. And I pray that God blesses you in this week and your study of His Word.